Okay, we're about to start this third session. We ask you all to be seated. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. We're going to be talking about the principles for healing conversation. My name is Susan Bell. I'm a professor in the Peace and Justice Studies program, and I have four very distinguished panelists. One of my favorite quotes is that there is too much at stake for us to surrender to the politics of polarization. And as we've learned today on several occasions throughout, one of the best means of mitigating polarization is through dialogue and through healing conversations. Conversations and understanding with people who are different from you, people who disagree with you, people who are ideologically opposed to you. And those healing conversations are absolutely critical to beginning the social healing that's necessary. So today we have four experts who are going to talk to us about the principles for having those conversations. First of all, I have Nijmie Dzurinko. They are the co-founder and volunteer coordinator at People First Pennsylvania, a statewide base-building human rights organization that is waging a war to make sure that health care is a human right. They're also a member of the University of the Poor and on the National Steering Committee of the Poor People's Campaign. Next to her is Sara Cook. Sara comes to us from Belfast. She is a mediator and conciliation specialist who has worked with conflict and violence-affected populations in Northern Ireland and internationally. I believe she's now working with Ukrainians. She served as a community mediator in contested regions of Belfast and facilitated dialogue between survivors of violence, security force members, and paramilitary members. And she's recently trained humanitarian aid workers resettling Syrian refugees in Turkey. John Kesler, to her right, is the founder and president of Salt Lake City Civil Network, a nonprofit corporation that supports interrelated individual and community flourishing and evolution in the global environment. And finally, Ben Cook. Ben is the former director of the BYU Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, but is also the co-founder of an NGO called Walking Distance. And the intent of that is an educational nonprofit organization that's to promote peace and equity. He's been a law professor at BYU where he taught courses on negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution, and a graduate of Georgetown Law School, and BYU, a master's in education. So we have four outstanding panelists. I'd like to give them 10 to 15 minutes each to present their comments, and then for the last 15 minutes we'll have an open Q&A. So let's start with Nijmie.
Okay. I grab the mic from you. Thanks so much, Susan. Thank you, everyone. Really glad to be here. And we're waging a campaign to make healthcare a human right, not a war, but just wanted to stress that point.
Sorry.
It's okay. You know, it is topical, but so yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm here as a co-founder of Put People First PA, and also a member and leader with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And I come here in my personal and political capacity. I'm not here as honestly, I'm not here as a professional. I'm not here as someone who is even paid to do this work. This is my political work. And so I want to start with a quote that's, I think, attributed to Kwame Nkrumah. Action without thought is blind, but thought without action is empty. And in the same kind of spirit, I want to say that the absence of conflict or unrest is not the presence of peace or justice, right? Just because we don't have visible conflict or unrest, it doesn't mean that we have peace and we have justice. And I think that's the situation that we have, certainly in this country today, where by the Poor People's Campaign estimates, we have 140 million people who are poor or near poor. And I think that is a number that is made invisible oftentimes. The official poverty line counts much lower, but the Poor People's Campaign counts by 200% of the sort of official federal poverty line, which means that almost half of this country is either already in poverty or will be thrown into poverty by one emergency bill, one emergency car breakdown, one emergency healthcare crisis. And so I want to suggest that a situation in which 140 million people are poor or near poor is not a situation of peace. It is an expression of a structure, an economic structure, a political structure that in fact produces violence. And so we talk in the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber, Reverend Liz talk about policy violence, structural violence. And we're in this moment now coming out of COVID, quote unquote, where some of the pandemic protections that were put in place are being rolled back. And those protections were actually effective at reducing poverty in this country. The expansion of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps, the protections for people on Medicaid that were mandated, states were mandated to have continuous coverage, so not to kick people off of Medicaid during the public health emergency, that is ending. And so we see 15 million people in this country getting ready to lose their health care, having their health care stripped away from them, starting on April 1st, in just a day or so. We see the rollback of SNAP benefits, we see the ending of the child tax credit, and this is all in the name of, quote unquote, going back to normal. But we also know that normal was a situation in which, according to Columbia University, 700 people were dying every single day in this country from causes related to poverty. So that's not a normal that we want to go back to. It's not a situation of peace or justice. And when we have a world in which one busload of billionaires have as much wealth as half of the global population, we have some serious problems, some serious violence that's taking place that is propped up and endemic to the system that we live in. So this is a really serious matter. I think this conversation and the topic of this conference is very, very serious. And so I think to get to this question of what are the key principles, I think that one of them is to understand that the purpose of healing is not to keep a false peace or to keep a fake peace in place. Like, that's not the purpose of it from my vantage point, but it's to bring about a real justice. And so then the question is, to have another principle is to understand, who are we really in conflict with? I think there's, especially in this country, a deep, deep, deep history of divide and conquer. That's what has allowed the system to stay in place despite different challenges over time. And so there's a lot of conflict that has been produced and promoted and propagated against perhaps the wrong targets. So we have to understand who our conflict is with. Is it with each other or not? And so another principle is trying to understand and know what rifts are you trying to heal, right? And I think that there's been, there can be a sort of implication in some of this work that it's not about choosing sides, it's not about picking a side. I would say the Poor People's Campaign thinks about that really differently, that there's not a contradiction between peace and nonviolence strategy and picking a side. I think if we even go back to the original Poor People's Campaign of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King and the folks in that campaign were very clear that they were on the side of the poor and dispossessed. They were on the side of the oppressed, but they still used nonviolence and peace building to achieve their goals. And so I don't think there's a contradiction between understanding what side you're on, but also choosing a peaceful and nonviolent path. So I think that's a really profound principle that we need to consider and internalize. And so in the last thing that I'll just say is that the way that I've approached this convening and this gathering is specifically to think about healing among that 140 million who have been so viciously and brutally divided and conquered for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and have been turned against each other, have been weaponized against ourselves in ways that have absolutely precipitated and propped up the status quo that we have today, which is the richest country that's ever existed in the history of the world, having the most COVID deaths in the entire world. Over 1 million people in this country have died from COVID. How can you reconcile that? How can you say that that is a situation of peace or of justice? It's not. And what has been able to, what has been the undergirding factor of that is this group of 140 million people that is not healed, that is not whole, that is not clear on who our real friends are. And so I think for the way that I enter this conversation is to heal those rifts in particular through organizing conversations, through conversations that start with people's experiences, that take us out of those, what we call mental fortresses, that get us right into that place of divide and conquer, right? Where we've been pitted against each other and we've internalized that. But to sort of get out of those fortresses, the left-right binary as an example, the partisan binary as an example, the racial divide, the geographic divide. These are all examples of things that that tend to keep the status quo in place. And so instead, we start from the point of view of people's concrete experiences, and then we find ways to not minimize our differences, but put what we have in common to the front. And that is a organizing conversation that leads people into an ongoing relationship. Dr. King talks about how we need to be in ongoing relationships with each other over a long period of time in order to make fundamental change, which I believe and we believe is needed. And that's a process. It's not a moment, it's not a conversation, it's a process. It's gonna take time. It's gonna take building leaders, many, 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 many leaders from among the ranks of this group of 140 million people. And so the first step in that process is that healing that can happen through an organizing conversation. And so that's how I enter this arena. That's what I stand on. And I thank you for your time and happy to be here today.
It's wonderful to be here with you. Can you hear me?
Switch right here.
We'll do a little test. Can you hear me? Okay, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm developing quite a soft spot in my heart for UVU, and so it's just a real pleasure to be back on campus and to be in conversation collectively over the last few days, but also individually with so many of you. It's a real joy. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the principles that drive difficult but healing conversations from a peace-building standpoint, and mainly drawn from the context of Northern Ireland, though I'll integrate some insights from different contexts around the world. So in some ways, I think we can look at peace-building as the art of the impossible. When you look at successful peace processes around the world, they never seem possible until they happen. And then all of a sudden, by a lot of hard work and maybe some miraculous occurrences, people are able to kind of find ways forward. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about peace building. It's an art and it's a science. And so today, as we talk about some of these insights, they're drawn both from the practice, the science of it, but also the art of these transformational movements that occur within peace building. So I think one of the first principles that can guide healing conversations is really the fact that we need to acknowledge the challenges within those spaces, but also to push back against the negativity bias. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday in our workshop, that it can be really important actually just to name those challenges that are in those spaces. So those challenges that divide us, those things that really have caused hurt over years and division. And for many people to acknowledge the trauma that people have experienced because of conflict or inequity, or those things that keep us apart can be really important. It can be a very important part, I think, of making that space safe and productive for those healing conversations. Just to really put it on the table and to name some of those difficulties between us. But I also think it's really important for us as people who may be convening healing conversations or facilitating those conversations to also really help groups and individuals that are coming together for those conversations to kind of push back against the negativity bias. So as humans, we're designed to really categorize and keep track of things that are uncomfortable, that are unpleasant, or risky to us. And so when people have experienced conflict and division, that's really forefront in our minds. We know what it feels like in our bodies when we're in conflict, even with another person. We know what that experience has been as a society or as a group within society. So we're very good at understanding and categorizing that for ourselves and keeping track of that in our memories collectively and individually. But one of the things that we often miss are then those signs of progress. People often lose sight of those really important gestures. We could have an entire conversation, a whole conference on kind of the importance of gestures of reconciliation between different parties. That certainly happens in Northern Ireland. Gift giving and hospitality, and these really unexpected encounters that opened up new spaces for the peace building process there. But people often miss those. People often miss actual progress within these healing spaces, these difficult conversations that can result in transformation. And so for us as practitioners, as people who are supporting these processes, to really be able to name that within the process, kind of really just pause for a moment and really notice what's just been said. Notice the progress we've made. Because people will often be so, I suppose, attentive to the difficulties between us in those spaces that they often miss the opportunity, the offerings, the bridge building that is actually taking place between them and them. And so it's really important for us to kind of draw that mediated concept into any sort of healing conversation that we're a part of facilitating, so really capturing that progress. I think one of the things that's important for us to cultivate within these healing conversations is curiosity. So I think, there was only one guiding principle to any process. It should be curiosity about the other. And people, when they're in these open conversations, asking questions for greater understanding, not asking questions to retaliate or to be able to formulate, a kind of a comeback to the other. Really, to invite people into a space where when we ask questions, it's because we're curious. We want to know more. We want to really understand the position of the other. And I think when we can cultivate that curiosity within peace building spaces, within civic dialogue, it really can lead to some beautiful and powerful things. Along the lines of curiosity, I think commitment to mutual transformation is really important. And that sounds really grandiose, but actually, so many times when we go into a process, it's really to advocate for our position. So we're going into a conversation to speak on behalf of our people, to really make sure that the other side hears us, understands what we want, what's important to us. And not often do we actually enter into difficult conversations with that desire to mutually be transformed and to lead to someone else's transformation. So that willingness to go in saying, I may not change my politics, I may not change my values, but I'm willing to look for a third space. I'm open to the possibility that I might be transformed in ways that I don't anticipate. And I want to seek that for the other people in the room too. It's not just about my transformation, about new possibilities for me or for my group that I represent, but actually new possibilities for us all. What are those creative spaces that we can step into? And again, for those of us who've been involved in some really interesting peace building conversations, that's the thing that often is what creates that transformation. When people are willing to take risks, when people are really open to third ways and to new possibilities. So I think it's as people who may be convening or already are a part of healing conversation spaces, really kind of trying to cultivate that desire amongst the different people in those conversations to commit to that sort of mutual transformation. I think acknowledgement is really important within these processes. I think for many people who have been deeply wounded by other people, by other groups, by our structures in society, I think often people want apology. They really want someone to stand up and say, that shouldn't have happened, I'm so sorry. And that's not always possible. Okay? Within these healing conversation spaces, it would be wonderful if that always happened. It doesn't always. Sometimes it's too much to ask of people. But what we can do is shape these spaces where people are able to be acknowledged so that people really hear each other's experiences, and even if they're still maintaining kind of fundamental disagreements, that people can say to each other in big and little ways, I see what you're saying. You know, I see you and understand your perspective. So even if I don't agree with it, I'm understanding of what you're saying. We saw that a lot in Northern Ireland, where people would come together for very difficult conversations, but very healing conversations. And one side would say to the other, you know, that's not what our paramilitaries told us. You know, what you're telling me now, that's not what we heard, but I believe you. And I'm going to go back to my community, and I'm going to share with them what you've said, because I think it's important that they hear that side as well. So that acknowledgement of the other can be really important. Finally, I suppose I'll end with saying that I think one of the really key aspects to healing conversations is really respecting people's right to share their own lived experience, and to have their own lived experience. And that really touches into what some of the speakers were saying earlier today, that we're not always going to find those points of commonality. Unfortunately, we're not always going to be able to transform conflict situations the way that we would like to. But when we can bring people together in spaces where, even if we're not respecting each other's political opinions or belief systems or what have you, we respect each other's right to lived experiences, and we listen with real respect to that, real transformation can happen. And I'll end with a story on that. One of the guiding principles I always use in convening dialogues and storytelling processes with people in Northern Ireland immediately after the Good Friday Agreement was just that. You know, you don't have to respect people themselves or what they've done or their politics or their religion, but you have to respect their right to tell their own story. And if you can do that, you can come to this process. And we had a woman who really got stuck on that. There are only 4 things on our list of guiding principles, and she's like, I can do all the others, I'm not sure about that. And I said, well, take some time to think about it, and we can talk about it. So she called me a couple days later, and she said her husband was killed by the IRA, the serving police officer, and he was blown up in a car bomb in front of their home. And she said, okay, I don't think I can respect someone's opinion or their right to their story from the IRA. Could I come to a gathering where there's not someone from the IRA? And I said, absolutely. We can't create that scenario, but if that's the case, I'm more than happy to invite you in. So she came to an event, and it was a really pivotal experience for her. And she came back and she said, okay, I think I'm ready to meet someone from the IRA. I can abide by that principle. Is that okay? And I said, of course. So we invited her, and she and this member of the IRA really connected, and bizarrely enough over poetry. Both
So the students who were coming, Israelis and Palestinians, had never had any interaction with someone from the other side, right? We were talking to some of the students, and it's sort of the way that the conflict has evolved there. I mean, it's so it feels so intractable and so difficult, but literal walls are up, and so there's just it's so hard to even if you wanted to reach out to the other side. It's culturally it's becoming really unacceptable, and so these students are coming. The Palestinian students we were talking to said, a couple of them said their families didn't even know where they were. They said, we're in Jordan doing some program. It was that sort of taboo to be somewhere with Israeli students. And one of the Israeli students said, I used to be scared. She said, first of all, I never even met a Palestinian, just very sheltered where she was. And she said, and I would get scared if I would hear Arabic. It was scary to me. And she said that I came here and we're in dorms with Israelis and Palestinians. We're eating meals together, we're taking classes together, and then they're also required to take classes on listening, conflict resolution, peace building things, right, along the way. And she said, I got to be friends with the Palestinians, and I started to get curious. I started to study Arabic. She said, now when I hear a woman yelling in Arabic, I realize she's just calling her kid to come in the house and not to kill all the Jews. And I thought that was so amazing to see that kind of transformation happen in just small scale, but real. And using the land is a source of so much conflict, but it's also a place where we can heal. So at walking distance, part of our model is we're focused on environmental disputes, and you see conflict, especially in the West here, right? Conflicts over land and water, and it's the cause of the conflict. But I think there's also something powerful about getting people back out on the land together to try and heal. So the third thing, the third and final thing I wanted to address is engaging hearts. So I think often when we try and resolve conflict, we try to engage minds. And it's important. We need to engage people's minds. My experience, my personal experience with this, and my general observation is that by itself is almost never enough. You can throw as many facts as you want at somebody, and they're not going to change their mind about some of these big issues, abortion, climate change, right? I mean, it's not a matter of changing a mind. I think we still have to pay attention to that, right? It's important. But I think I would love to see more creative work done around engaging people's hearts. So how do we engage people's hearts? Well, again, I think you look at Native and Indigenous traditions, there's lots of rituals around music and different things that actually speak to people. One of the things a powerful method that I really love is through poetry. Again, something Sara mentioned, and I think a lot of people don't like poetry because it's confusing, or I don't understand what the poet's trying to say. And certainly poetry can engage our mind, but the real power in poetry is the way it engages our hearts. Even if I don't know what's being said, just like music can convey a feeling, poetry is speaking to not just our minds, but our hearts. And I think if we can start thinking creatively about how do we pull in things like music, poetry, that can really speak to people's hearts, I think we'll have more success in engaging people. It doesn't always mean that I'm going to get somebody to just do a 180 on whatever position they're in, but I think when we engage a heart, it opens people up to more than they would have been. I wanted to close with just a poem we have on our website, and as you listen to this poem, I encourage you, invite you to, think about it, right? But maybe just see how it makes you feel, right? Especially if you're a person who thinks, I'm not somebody who likes poetry. Especially if that's you, just see how it makes you feel more than, what was she saying there? It's not one of these poems that's really complex. That's one thing that I think, it's not going to be distracting that way. see if it speaks to you at all. So the poet's name is Rosemary Traumer, and her poem that I'm reading is called "I'm Not Saying We Shouldn't Be Angry." I'm not saying we shouldn't be angry. Anger seems reasonable. But perhaps we will do what I've heard the Inuit do. Spend the emotion on walking. Walk a line until all the anger has left our bodies. The moment the Inuit notice the anger is gone, replaced perhaps by sadness or fear, compassion, or just a quietness, they mark that spot with an object to show the extent of their anger. And perhaps, if we're lucky, when we walk this way, it will be a long enough walk that we arrive at each other's doors, object in hand. And when the object leaves our grip, we'll be able to use our hands to greet each other, touch each other's faces, point to the horizon, to all the other places we might choose to walk now together. Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists for some wonderful suggestions and comments and ideas for holding conversations. I'd like to open it up for questions. Do we have a microphone on? Yes. Does anybody? All right.
So I really appreciated the comments about justice, and it kind of made me think in everything that we've been talking about today. In these conversations, there's got to be a time where there's people that are trying to heal, but are confronted with one side having a need for justice, and the other side maybe afraid of relinquishing the upper hand, you know? And I'm wondering if there's, like, how do you deal with that situation?
Okay. Anybody want to answer? Nijmie?
I mean, I can say something about it.
Okay. You certainly have.
Thanks for, referencing that piece. I think I think that my colleagues could speak to that. I'm coming from it less from like trying to mediate between the powers that be and the powerless. And I'm talking more about building unity among the powerless, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, but I hear you. I think that the powerful are not, their hearts and minds are not open, really, right? They move when masses of people move. They move when they have no choice. They move when it becomes politically necessary for them to move. I don't think that's just, I'm not just talking out of, this is literally what we can learn from history. And so my interest is in how do we heal those rifts among people who have been divided by those powers, who can't see what they could stand to gain or what they have in common, who can't come together, and that's on purpose and that's by design. How do we do that healing so that they can be a force for justice? Because I don't think, I don't think that it's not about individually bad people, right? But it's about the structures that we live in that are pernicious. And so how did those things change? I mean, I think we have to look historically at how those things change, and they change by massive numbers of people who have been previously maybe distrustful, mistrustful of each other, figuring out how to heal those divides and come together and change it. That's kind of where I'm entering from, which isn't really an answer to your question, because that's not as much about, I think that's a valid question. I think it's something to be interested in. And I just think that, I'm approaching it from a slightly different way, but there might be other people here who want to speak to that too.
So if we take Northern Ireland as a contextual example, Protestants have been in charge since the founding of the Northern Irish state 100 years ago, and they still are. So for people who are not nerdy about Northern Irish politics, it might be helpful to know that we have no sitting government, and part of the reason for that, The reason that's publicly quoted is anger over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is associated with Brexit and essentially determines Northern Ireland to be not in sync with the rest of the United Kingdom. So the party that has the most votes amongst the Protestants has said, no, we're not going to take up our seats in government until this is sorted out. But many of us feel that the real reason is because when they take up that seat, if they do, it will be the first time in Northern Irish history that a Catholic is first minister of Northern Ireland. And this particular Protestant leader and this particular Protestant party don't want to be the ones on whose watch this happens, okay? And so we've got this real stalemate where Protestants don't want to give up power. And that's simplifying it, because we're all in positions of power in different parts of our lives. And none of us want to give it up. None of us really want to kind of be seen to put ourselves at a disadvantage. We don't step away from privilege very easily. And so it's a real conundrum. How do you change this? How do you square this circle? And the one thing that, I really feel does help to help people want to have a future that is positively influenced by the other is to really engage in storytelling. So it goes back to what Ben said. One of the quotes I shared with my my workshop group yesterday is, stories change hearts and hearts change minds. So if we want to change the heart, never mind getting to changing the mind, it really helps to start with story first, because people have to be mutually invested. So if you're gonna find ways to change power dynamics, particularly ones that are entrenched, the people in power need to want to do that. To a certain extent, they need to want to put that down and look for a third way or a new way forward. And I think one of the only ways that people can do that is to see people who are in a position not of power as human beings with valid stories and interesting lives that they actually want to invest in to find a new way forward. So it's not simple at all, but that is the only thing I've seen, particularly in Northern Ireland, but in other contexts as well, where we start to see that shift, where people in positions of power start to say, well, maybe I could, or maybe we could, or let's maybe look at something new that we've never considered before. But the challenge for that is making spaces where it's safe enough for people to share their story and getting a critical mass where that takes place. So if you can get to politicians, for example, you can start to make some change, but it's really hard to get enough politicians to the table, for example, to have some of these conversations. So people who are behind the levers of power, it's very difficult to get them into spaces. So you can definitely have bottom up, and I think no process of change or transformation really takes place without the bottom up, but you also need the top down. And that can be a real challenge, getting a critical mass of people to hear each other's stories, to engage on this human level in a way that allows for top-down, bottom-up transformation.
Maybe I could just briefly respond in terms of, say, for instance, the polar patterns we would work with that are implicit in the skillful means we use to kind of deal with the situation. So we have a polarity on the one side of community or communion or justice versus freedom or agency. There's the social justice we need, but then there's the freedom we need, and they're both really important. And then to realize, to hold that maturely, they begin to come together. You have agency in communion, find that purpose that's greater than yourself. If you can find that still place in that relational environment, it's a place of deep trust. And so part of the facilitative job is to bring people together and find a way to find a place of deep trustfulness, and ultimately in a facilitation to get people connected to that which they trust in, ultimately, whether you call it the divine or the higher self or the source of life, whatever it is, it generates a quality of hopefulness, and it generates a quality of love. And so that's a framing background piece where you can sort of work with those flourishing principles. And then there's a power polarity of control and submission. And so most of that is not very visible in how we work, but we say we understand some polar principles of flourishing and some spiritual principles of flourishing, and we can use those as tools in the strategy we use to bring people together. So that's just an example of some of the principles behind how we operate in Unify.
Ben, do you want to have any, do you have any comment? No, okay.
I love all of this discussion, and I know that you all have specific skills and processes and models that you use. I'm wondering what your best advice is if someone's listened to you today, wants to go home and start doing this, start having healing conversations. So either contextualizing it within your own personal lives, like where do you do this and where do you build relationship by telling a story or whatever it is, or what's your best advice for someone who may not be a trained facilitator who just wants to start doing this?
Do you want to start, Ben?
I think it's a really great question. I think it's really important because we can talk a lot, and it's important to talk about it. But what do we do with what we've talked about? So a couple years ago, there was a publication on campus that asked me to write something about how do you have. It was like right before Thanksgiving, I think. So they said, what are 3 pieces of advice you have, or something about having political conversations with family. And I stopped having political conversations with my dad about 15 years ago. For a long time, I kept thinking, maybe I'll change his mind if I just talk a little more. And he thought the same thing. Anyway, kind of gave up just for the sake of the relationship. And as I'm writing this piece, I'm like thinking of these different pieces of advice. And I thought, if I can't even talk to my dad, I mean, what am I saying here? So I called my dad, and I was very open about what I was doing. I said, Dad, I know we haven't talked about politics for 15 years, but we need to be able to talk about that, right? Because, this coming back to this point I was making about, seeing people as people. I mean, if I can't see my dad as a person when it comes to talking politics, some random person that, is making some comment online is so much, that person I know nothing about, and it's so much easier to objectify that person. So anyway, I think going out and, starting close to home, right? Maybe it's a family member, maybe you have somebody in your life like I have with my dad, and finding ways to engage, right? Like that. And, so the specific thing I did with, I know, Becky, you're familiar with some of these tactics, but it was just said, okay, Dad, you're going to tell me one thing that you like about my political party, and I'm going to tell you one thing I like about your political party. And I said, and I'll start. And I did, and I shared something, and it took him a long time to come up with something, but I got really emotional when he shared. And it was such a little thing. it was almost not a thing. But I was so, I sort of teared up because my dad has never said anything. He's never given any ground. And I don't know if he felt the same way. I probably haven't given ground either. But I think, there's, so Living Room Conversations is an organization that goes with, and I think, finding, like, I think there's lots of online resources, people out there doing good work at that grassroots level. So, that's one recommendation is put it into practice in whatever sphere you're in. If maybe it's just family members. Maybe, we had some school teachers in my workshop yesterday. Great, right? Teaching government, going back to the government classes, talking about it. I think, the point of those workshops yesterday was exactly that kind of thing. You're right, there's lots of models, right? And, go down the row, and, we all kind of took a different approach to the workshops. But, so I think there's not, obviously not a single right way, but I think starting wherever you're at and engaging, find a tool that you think, hey, this could work, even if it's simple, and going from there.
I'll just mention a simple strategy is, whatever the topic is, explore whether you agree on the facts and circumstances behind it. And most likely, there's a lot of disagreement. There's such separate, different narratives. And to sort of be able to calmly accept that and be calm with the other person and say, we've got very different stories here, so we're not going to solve it. We're not going to solve it. But do we have any shared values around this topic? And most people can find a shared value. And from that shared value, even if all the facts and circumstances create different stories, you can maybe explore that way. And if that isn't possible, and you can set, with that shared value that you find, well, maybe we could get together and talk about something else, or work on something else that we share this value. So that's just a simple little triage process that you can do.
So I'd recommend starting with some baby steps if you're kind of trying to find your land legs with this. So there's a process called inquiry-based listening that we tried on for size in our workshop yesterday, where each person has 10 minutes to share their thoughts on a particular theme. And then there's no interruption, so the first person goes and they speak for 10 minutes, or as long as they want within that 10 minutes without being interrupted. And then the other person makes a statement of support or affirmation. So similar to what you were mentioning, Ben. That person has to say, even if I fundamentally disagree with everything you've just said, there'll be at least one thing that resonates with me or that I can pick out. So kind of making that affirming statement and asking a question for clarity or greater understanding. And we talked about acknowledgement earlier. Having someone really hear you and acknowledge that they've heard you by saying something of support or affirmation, and then asking a question that just lets you know that they really care enough or they want to know more, can really open up some wonderful spaces between people. So that's something simple. You can do the whole thing in 30 minutes, and that can be a wonderful way to kind of ease into some of these conversations, to build trust, to move in that direction. You can also use creative techniques to encourage dialogue or storytelling, like the beads that we did in last year's workshop. But one of the things I really recommend is that you connect with someone doing practice that you respect, that's engaged in this kind of practice, and asking them for resources, asking them to be in conversation with you, because a lot of us have found real joy in what we do. It's a real privilege, and people are really happy to share what they've learned and to answer questions. I mean, in a sense, opening up healing conversation space can be done by anyone, anywhere. So you can think about people that in your own sphere who are divided, and bring them together for conversation. But it's also really risky, and it's also really vulnerable, and particularly if people have experienced disadvantage or prejudice or have been wounded by division, there can be a lot of trauma there. So, on one hand, it's very simple. On one hand, it's very delicate, and you need to be really careful with those processes. So I would really recommend finding someone and asking them for that support, and I think most people will really be happy to give it, and will give you a good steer, because sometimes it's not that kind of stuff you can read in books. I shouldn't say that at a university, at an academic conference, but sometimes facilitation that really safely holds these vulnerable spaces, you can't really get from reading a book. So I would really recommend finding a colleague you respect and beginning that conversation.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I have one for Nijmie. You spoke of dealing with the poor and this group as being weaponized against each other, suffering decades of structural violence, and that the first real healing conversations you needed were to heal the rifts within that group. Mm-hmm. How do you do those healing conversations and then convince them that it is worthwhile doing a conversation with the powerful, those that are oppressing them?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that what I covered in the workshops yesterday for 4 hours that I was with folks were, really similar to what a lot of people said, right? That storytelling is super important, that getting to know each other as people is really important, and that's the foundation of an organizing conversation, which is what I have shoehorned into this discussion about healing conversations, because that's where I'm coming from. And so what an organizing conversation is a beginning point to connect to somebody, and it's often across a line of difference. If you're knocking a door, you don't know who's going to be on the other side. Just to say, in the Poor People's Campaign, we're active in 40 states, and we believe in organizing across whole states, whole communities. And that means that we're in counties across states. We're in urban and rural and suburban and small town areas. We're crossing every line of division in what we call fusion organizing. And that means that by its nature, we're going to be coming up against differences. And so that first contact has to be a healing conversation or an organizing conversation. And so it starts with simply saying a little bit about who you are in a way that tends to not put people in a mind frame of oppositional, of being in opposition. So to state and to introduce yourself in a way that doesn't draw out that opposition, that is unexpected, that isn't simply what folks are used to, which is that, you know, once a year someone knocks on their door and tries to get them to vote for someone or tries to get them to give money to a candidate, right? And so you have to come to people not in that lens, not in that frame of mind, as an everyday person, as a neighbor, as someone who is just like them in a lot of ways. And then you ask questions. And so the second part of the conversation is about listening, and that is about asking them about their experience with something. So in Pennsylvania, for instance, we ask people about their experiences with the healthcare system. And that is a really open-ended question that tends to draw out a lot of things. It's not about analysis, it's not about arguing, it's not about trying to get someone to a specific position, it's just asking them about their experience. And sometimes if they can't connect to their own experience, you can ask them about the experience of their family or someone that they care about, because we know that sometimes we can feel more deeply and more strongly about someone we care about even than, you know, we can necessarily connect to ourselves and what we've been through. And so that brings out a lot of responses in people. And then there's an agitation, which is not about annoying someone. It's a different meaning of that word. It's really about asking people to consider, like, why things are the way that they are, or why they think that it's this way, or what would it take to change this situation. It's also a very open-ended question. Sometimes people say, I don't know, I've never thought about that, which is good, right? Just to kind of get folks to be honest. And sometimes people say, well, it would take, you know, people say a lot of things. People say a lot of really powerful things, actually, in answer to that question. And then there's always a commitment at the end of the conversation, and that commitment is to take an action or to take a step. Because as I mentioned before, I strongly believe that this is a process. It's not just a one-off kind of thing. And so if we are going to bridge divides and heal, we have to be in an ongoing long-term relationship with each other. And so there's an invitation to join something, to become part of an organization, to become part of a larger structure. And so that's the conversation. That's the way the conversation goes. And I've experienced it many times. I've conducted it many times. I find it to be extremely effective. And so then from there, you know, that's the beginning of the process of figuring out how to move forward and what, you know, to collectivize our strategy and to identify our tactics. But I think I'll probably just stop at that point. I know you asked kind of a second part of the question, but I think that's a little bit more than we have time for today, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, that was very helpful. Do we have any other questions, any other comments? I think we're all getting tired. Okay, if there are, okay, Clayton.
The idea of we can share, we can talk. How do we get somebody to engage? Meaning, I mean, they can not just engage with us, but you can actually see a change in the people's behavior, and then moving on and saying thank you, or I'd like to get back with you because I think I have more to offer, or whatever. Is there a story behind the story? I mean, are they from this day forward change forever?
Anybody want to answer? Nijmie, I think.
Other people can answer first because I just spoke.
Okay. Ben?
Sorry, Clint, I'm not sure I caught what you were asking.
So you have this conversation, they got engaged, they love what you experienced with them,
Yeah.
and now you let them go, and they either was made as wonderful, but maybe they didn't really change, or kind of like being stuck with the behavior or something like that. Do you have another level that you say, we ought to get back together again?
Yeah, I mean, toward sort of midway through my time teaching at the law school here, I found that students really, I taught negotiation and mediation, and they were simulation based, and so they were a little different than a lot of law school classes. And I think people inherently just thought it was fun because it was a little different than just a doctrinal class. But I started getting concerned about this idea, how is it actually sticking? People go out, are they actually carrying these tools with them, or is it just sort of a fun exercise? Because at the end of the semester, people would evaluate the class and generally give it good evaluations, right? So by that short-term measure, it was fun. But really, I wanted longer-term success, and I think, doing stuff to make it stick, I think is the challenge. And so I don't think sort of these one-off efforts. You come in and you do just a one-off training. And one of the things that's important to us at Walking Distance is really embedding with the community, right? It's not just kind of parachuting in as a mediator. Look, sometimes that may be the only thing that's possible in a given situation, but I think really looking at a system. When you're looking at a system, system isn't necessarily going to change because I came in. I mean, I've experienced that myself. I've gone through a training, and I thought that was so great. And even the next week, I couldn't tell you what the 3 main points were. I would usually remember stories. So I think building into the work we do, it's got to be, there's got to be, not just a one-time, big impact thing. It's thinking long-term. How are we going to work with a community in a way that's looking at the system and over time. And I think that's critical, because otherwise we're spending a lot of effort doing these short-term feel-good. I mean, maybe they're feel-good, right? Sometimes they're not effective, but yeah, I think it's important that you highlighted that.
Okay, Sarah. Sarah,
But go ahead.
we've only got about 3 minutes.
So I'll say very briefly, I think for some people, we're all very different. So for some people, one catalytic experience can change them forever. And they go back and they take action and they share with their family and their community. But I do think when people re-engage over and over and over again, they walk a often more difficult path, but a more transformative one. And I'll give you a very brief example. They do very public work. Joe Barry and Pat McGee are now known in many parts of the world for their story. Joe Barry's dad was on Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, and Pat McGee was the member of the IRA who planted the Brighton bomb, and the Brighton bomb killed her father. And Joe had this deep, people all need something different with difficult losses like that. And Joe's need was really just to hear Pat's story. She just needed to look him in the eye and really hear from him what was happening for him that was behind that decision. And what that's led to is a 20-year relationship where the two of them work together and they speak together. They're still telling their story, but they're doing a lot of work publicly. And it's really hard. I've seen them in conversations where they're really struggling in that moment with each other and their collective story and individual stories. And other times they're in an easier space where there's a lot of gratitude for where they are together. And it's a very powerful relationship. And they do a lot of really important peace building work just by embodying the fact that this kind of transformation is possible. But I think the depth of that relationship, the longevity of it, the continued willingness to engage in really difficult but really healing conversations is a beautiful model of what you're suggesting, that if people continue to come back together for conversation over time, it can be really transformative.
So I'm just going to say a variation on the theme of what I said before is, in my experience, people are in conflict because they don't feel connected. And if you find a way to connect them, it's transformative. all of a sudden they feel like they're not dealing with some kind of alien being. And I think I'll tell a story about Navajo wisdom. I mean, what you shared this morning was so beautiful, the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom from your tradition. And one framing practice we have is that if you can be deeply calm and have a deep sense of equanimity, and if you can accept what is, you connect with that life force. You connect in a foundational spiritual way that's there. And to have people open up to that because you found some way to create a connection creates an opportunity to build on that. And I've doesn't always happen, maybe it doesn't happen most of the time, but I found people who were so surprised and so much in a healing process by finding that they had something, some heart-to-heart or other kind of connection or some shared value that it's catalytic. It's catalytic.
Yeah, I'll just use this as a moment to plug my mentor, Willie Baptist, who wrote a fantastic book called It's Not Enough to Be Angry. You can actually go online and just download that. You don't even have to pay for it. But he says that when someone is pregnant, when you first find out someone's pregnant, you don't tell them to push, right? That would be ridiculous, right? They have to go through a process to get to that point. So I think this is also a process. I think I've been saying this. For us, it's actually starting someone on a leadership development pathway that leaders aren't born, they're developed. And so to continue to grow and to transform, you have to be on a conscious pathway of doing that. And I think that happens in the context of organization. I think power comes from organization, and I think that we have to have organizations that grow and develop people who can continue to transform themselves, transform people around them, and that's a process that takes a long time. For us, that's a leadership development pathway.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank all of you who attended and took your time to come this afternoon. And I want to thank our 4 excellent panelists. I think we've heard a lot of wisdom up here this morning, and I hope this afternoon, and I hope that we can carry it with us. So thank you for coming, and let's give them a big hand of applause.